I was saying, man, this week is pretty busy. And then I said to my wife, but the rest of the month isn't too bad. And she's like, yeah, if you don't include Easter and Syrup Festival, you know. So she was saying, yeah, we say this next week will be a little lighter over and over until the Lord returns. So join with me in Esther. Esther. This week, we're picking back up on part 2 of Esther's responsibility. I got to find Esther myself here. Just give me 1 second. All right, this story of Esther is such an incredible one as we look at God's providence and how He's in control. He's with us in every situation. And all through the book of Esther, God's name is not mentioned once, and yet we see His hand all through it. And as we look at the blame game, again, we see times in which we run from responsibility. We don't want any part of responsibility. And there's times when God says, hey, you need to step up to the responsibility that I've given to you in your life. And in Esther's story, we see both happen. Where Esther wanted to run, she wanted to forsake the responsibility she had because she knew that if things went the way she expected them to go, she was looking at death. If things went great, she was looking at causing a lot of friction within the empire, the Persian Empire, to be very specific. So let's give you some background for the book of Esther. Esther is written in a time when the Jews were in the dispersion. They were ruled by the Persian Empire. And last week I was talking about King Ahasuerus. It's the same king as King Xerxes that's mentioned within different versions or translations of the Bible. So if you had that kind of disconnect last week, I apologize for that. But as we look at it, my Bible uses the word Ahasuerus. Xerxes is what he's known as well. Xerxes was this powerful guy who he was in charge of 127 provinces over the span of 3,000 miles as the crow flies, and that includes a huge peninsula in the midst of it. He owned from Ethiopia all the way to India, 6-hour flight if you were to fly the distance that he controlled. If you were to fly that today, it'd take you 6 hours. I looked up the flight. I almost booked one myself, but I decided I probably should be here. And as we think about all that he owned, we come to the point where we see him 3 years into his reign deciding, hey, I'm going to throw this party. I'm going to throw a party. And he gathered together all of his leaders from the 127 provinces, had them together for 6 months while they threw this crazy party. And then at the end of it, he says, I kind of want to have a special party for my local people too. And for 7 days, he continued on with this party. The ladies had a special banquet during those 7 days, and they had a men's banquet as well during those 7 days. During this banquet, he asked his queen, Vashti, he says, I'd like you to appear before our men's banquet. And we don't need all the details. We don't even know all the details. There's tradition. There's lots of speculation onto what actually happened. Vashti says no. Because of that, his advisors come around him and they decide that you need to depose of Vashti, you need to demote her, and you need to put somebody else in her place. And he thought that sounded good, so he went along with that. And then time passed, and he began to regret, or he began to think clearly, it says soberly, about the situation. And as he was kind of contemplating what he wanted to do next, you see his servants and the people who took care of him recommend this beauty pageant. You don't need old Queen Vashti. We've got a new solution for you. Gather all the 127 provinces. There's got to be some beautiful women. We'll get them sent here to headquarters in Susa. We'll have a beauty pageant, a beauty contest, and we see that they were prepared for 12 months. 12 months. I know it takes my family time to get ready to go places, but it took them 12 months to be ready to prepare and present themselves before the king. We also realize that it was about 4 years before Esther was actually made queen. So now she's queen. The other person in the story, his name is Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jew. He's working within the king's gates, and he happens to be the adoptive father of Esther. Esther's parents were killed. I don't know what the situation was surrounding their deaths, but they were killed. And so Esther's cousin, Mordecai, took care of her from a very young age. Esther got rounded up in this beauty pageant. She decided she was told, you're going to prepare for to be presented before the king. And Mordecai was pacing back and forth, wondering what is going on with Esther. And he often wondered, as a father would in this situation. And so then we see another person come on the scene, and his name is Haman. Haman is an evil man who's very anti-Semitic, which means he doesn't like Jews. And as he's walking through this situation, he says to the king, and the king doesn't know Esther's a Jew, and the king doesn't know that Haman's basically out to just get rid of Mordecai. Basically, Haman says to the king, I'm going to give you 10,000 talents, and I'd like to kill the Jews. The king says, here's my signet ring. Do what you want to do. They don't even talk, in the scriptures, they don't even talk finances after that moment. It's basically just, hey, whatever you do is up to you. You can make that decision. And so he did. He set a time in which the Jews were going to be executed. And that is basically where our story is today as we pick it up. And so if you look at Mordecai, Mordecai heard about this decree to kill all the Jews. It was men, women, children. It was all of them. It was basically going to be a genocide of the Jewish nation. We can go to slide 3 now, Kyle. If you think about Mordecai, he was within the king's gates. He was probably an advisor of the king at times. And we see him grieving. We see that he had also uncovered a plot in which to kill the king. And he exposed that plot, and the king was very thankful, wrote it down in a book. Mordecai was so distressed by this that he tore his clothes and began grieving. Esther, within the harem, within the place where the women were kept, she heard of this, and she sent clothes by this messenger to find out what caused this distress in Mordecai's life. And so if you go to Esther chapter 4, verse 4, it says, so Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. What did they tell her? The command. And then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs who he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So he went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hatak returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he is but one law, put all to death, except to the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. So there was no escaping this decree. It was a Persian decree, and she says, Mordecai, don't you understand? There's this one law that if you go into the king's chambers and you're not called, he has a law that says, I don't allow that. And if he's feeling good, he has a scepter in which he can raise it. And I'll be able to enter in to his grace. Remember, Mordecai knew of the laws. He wasn't some person who wasn't aware of it or was asking her to just do something willy-nilly. As someone who works within the kingdom, he would be no stranger. But the risk to her obedience was what? The risk to her obedience was death, but the risk was far outweighed by this decree for all the Jews to be wiped out, right? Because if all the Jews were wiped out, it also included who? Her, Esther. And oftentimes our fears that keep us from our responsibility are not well balanced when emotions and close proximity to the problems and to the situation have their say first. But she needed to act in order to deliver or to have deliverance for herself. And just as Daniel down the line, we learned that Daniel down the line could not escape King Darius's decree. King Darius was a friend with Daniel, and there was little likelihood that Esther was just going to be able to escape this decree just because of her position. And Mordecai's plea to Esther is iconic. It's so convicting and reassuring also to us as we choose whether we're going to trust God in our life and obey him first. Are we going to do that, or are we going to fear the things that he's calling us to do in life and try to avoid all the risks that we know about? What are we going to do? What was Esther going to do? If you look in chapter 4, verse 13, this is Mordecai's response. After he hears Esther's concern about dying, that's a pretty valid concern, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this." That's the iconic statement of the story of Esther. Who knows if you've not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's my question to each and every one of us. What does God have you in the position you're in that he wants to use and he can use for his glory? What has your story that's been written through all these years? Maybe you've been ripped away from family. Maybe you've found yourself in a situation that you had no control over. Maybe you've been prepared for 12 months just for a chance at something. What is God doing in your life to put you in the place and the influences that you are in right now to glorify him or to find deliverance for the people in your life? He was confident. Mordecai was confident in God's promise that the Jews would not be destroyed. But he was not confident that his family, Esther's family, would be able to survive this decree. Ultimately, he reminded her that God does not operate on coincidences, but on intentional actions, intentional responsibilities. Maybe he raised her up to find deliverance. Maybe God raised her up personally to find deliverance personally for Esther and her family, but also nationally for the nation of Israel, for the Jews. So obeying the Lord gives us this chance to find deliverance in him, and then also it gives us the ability to wait on him for protection against our enemies. As we go on to the next slide, we see that God gives responsibilities. Slide number 4 there. God responds to enemies' actions against our responsibilities in his timing. All right, so if we go to 5 and verse 13, it says this: "Moreover, Haman said," go back to verse 12, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet she had prepared. Tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king." We're going to have to gain some context to this, right? All right, so Haman was feeling pretty good about his life. After they made this decree to kill all the Jews, they basically sat down and drank together, the king and Haman. He was kind of frustrated about all that was going on with Mordecai, because every time he would encounter Mordecai, Mordecai would not bow to him, and Mordecai would not cower in his presence. And so as we see that, we kind of move forward. Well, here, Haman's plot against Mordecai is actually foiled pretty brilliantly. All right, Haman went out that day in verse 9, joyful and with a glad heart. What did he do? Well, Esther had put together this banquet for the king. She tested, if I present myself before the king, is he going to say, you get to live, or is he going to kill me? Well, thankfully, he said, you can live. Then she had the request. The request was, I want to set up a banquet for you, and I want to set up a banquet for Haman. At the first banquet, everything went well. They sent him home and said, let's have another banquet. Let's have another banquet, and then I'll tell you what's going on. Well, Haman went out after the first banquet, joyful and with a glad heart, verse 9. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Very interesting. Why did he restrain himself? And he sent and called for his friends and his wife, Zeresh. Scary name if I ever knew one, Zeresh. All right, then Haman told them of his great riches. Don't take anything away from that. That was just me commenting. All right, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above officials and servants of the king. So, Haman was placed in this humiliating position because of his desperation for respect and his disdain for opposition. The moment he was planning to get his revenge, it all humorously flipped on him and left him eventually hanging from his own gallows. Esther had since called for this banquet already. Haman had already attended the one, and boy, oh boy, did he feel special for it. As he was walking home in joy and happiness, he met eyes with Mordecai, and something didn't settle with him at all. And it was just incredible that after the years of Mordecai and Haman serving in close proximity, it was this time frame that Mordecai really begins to get under the skin of Haman. He restrained himself that night, and you're thinking, he must have really been upset. What did he restrain himself from doing? Haman controlled himself at that moment, went home, this is funny. He called for his family and his friends to tell them just how awesome he is. He's like, guys, come on over. And we learn later that he has a lot of kids. A lot of kids. And so they're there. He's basically telling them how rich he was. It says it right here in the Bible. He tells them how many kids he had, all his promotions, and how he was second in command. And then he began to talk about this exclusive banquet that Haman was being invited to with Esther and the king and Zeresh, his wife. And his friend says, well, why are you so upset then? Why does Mordecai get under your skin? And Zeresh and his friend says, just kill Mordecai. With the king's blessing, go to that second banquet in peace with Esther. Like, don't be so mad, just kill him. I mean, if problems were dealt with that simply, this would be a crazy world. He made gallows before approval for Mordecai. Apparently, he thought it would be a slam dunk suggestion. And with his position, I don't doubt that it would probably be, if God wasn't in control, a slam dunk suggestion to the king. Hey, I'd like to kill Mordecai. Oftentimes, our expectations do not equal reality. And Haman was in for a surprise in the morning. When the king had looked for a way to honor Mordecai, if you don't know, the king had a dream that night. Or no, the king couldn't sleep that night. Sorry, different king. He couldn't sleep that night, and he called for the chronicles of the king to be read to him. And in the Chronicles, he finds that Mordecai had saved his life by reporting the assassination plot against the king. And so as the king is reading this, he's thinking, man, did we ever honor this guy? Did we ever do anything special for him? And we see what happens next is Haman comes really early in the morning because he wants to make a suggestion. What do we know about the king's court? We don't go in unless we're called to. The king says, who's out in the court this morning? And they say, Haman's out in the court. And the king says, great, he's one of my trusted advisors. He actually has my signet ring. He makes a lot of decisions for me. They call him in, and the king says to Haman, if you were to honor someone, how would you do it? And Haman gives him this list of all the things that Haman wants done to him. And the king says, that sounds pretty good, and says, do this for Mordecai. The guy who you hate. Do this for Mordecai. And the king had no idea that he had just prepared gallows overnight. I mean, he didn't even pull a permit. He just threw him up there. Not neat and kind. Anyway, moving on. He quickly built the gallows, and they were standing. And what we see is this irony that he has to go around proclaiming Mordecai was deserving of the honor. God still needed Mordecai in place, and because of that, nothing happened to him. Instead, what Haman meant for evil ended up with Haman throwing Mordecai this party, this celebration. On the day he had his workers working overtime to create gallows for Mordecai, God had Haman lead him on a parade of honor. Crazy stuff. This is such an amazing story. Isn't this wild? And then we find out, as he's pouting about the embarrassment of it all, and he's just really upset. As he's doing all this, he then gets whisked away to the second banquet. No time to lick his wounds. He is thrust right into another banquet with Esther. And that's when everything falls down around his plan. No time to hang Mordecai. Instead, Esther exposes the plan, and the king sends him to be hung on the gallows that he had made for Mordecai. In the right timing, in the nick of time, God ordered the events absolutely perfectly, as he does in our lives, if we look. Wait on the Lord's timing. Leave vengeance in his hands. Leave your protection in his hands. Understand and trust him in all circumstances. And never forget that each individual is personally responsible to do what God has called them to do. If we can advance to the next slide, that'd be great. And it's that God chooses more than just the formal leaders to stand up and calls everyone to be responsible. How does that impact us right here as a church in Vermontville? It's not just going to be, the leaders cannot accomplish everything we need. We're going to need the body of Christ, every one of us. And who is the head? The head is Jesus Christ, and he's asked us to be his ambassadors. We talked about that in Sunday school. And so there is a responsibility for every person within this building that has placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ to do what he's called them to do. Let's go to chapter 8, verse 11. We're going to touch on that in just a second. Let's go through a couple thoughts first. A detail that is often lost and overlooked is that the king did not revoke the letters sent by Haman. They were going to be fulfilled 11 months from the time that they were initiated in the first month. So they were going to be taken out and dealt with. All the Jews were going to be killed in the 12th month. That gave them 11 months. After what Esther, what Haman was trying to do to Mordecai, and after she revealed the plan that Haman was trying to kill all the Jews, including her, we see that the king basically flips everything. Kills Haman, and then gives Haman's house to Esther, and gives Haman's authority to Mordecai. And then he says, as Mordecai says, we got to figure out something, as Esther says, we got to figure out something for the Jews, the king once again does what he does best. He delegates the decision. At the party, he delegated the decision of what should be done with the queen. With Haman, he says, let's not talk about money. Here's my ring. Do what you want to do. And he makes that decree about the Jews and killing them. Then they go on as business as usual. The king does it again here. And he gives Mordecai the powers to do what he needs to do in response. And so as a result, Jews everywhere were commanded, gather together and protect your lives. Gather together and protect yourself. Every time I've read Esther before, I've thought that basically they just make another command and then everything is just peachy. Because that's the way it feels like when you're watching the videos or watching the children's stories about Esther, is that Haman Haman gets killed on the gallows, and then Mordecai steps in and makes this decree to save all the Jews. Well, the first decree was not removed, but they were given the ability to stand up and protect their lives on that certain day. They had about 9 months for this command to reach all the Jews before the 13th day of the 12th month, in which the previous allowance to execute any Jew would be acted upon. Here we think that all the pressure and the responsibility was solely on Esther. And once Esther stood up, it was just all fine. But no, they still had many enemies. We find out from the story that 500 enemies on just the first day in that capital city where they were at that time. Just the first day of defense, they killed the 500 enemies of the Jews. And because there were so many enemies, Esther came to him and came to the king and asked for them to have another day to kill the rest of the active enemies of the Jews. Altogether, as a result of protecting their lives from massacre, they killed 75,000 enemies and took zero plunder. It was all in defense, and it was for the purpose of enjoying peace from their fear. Everyone is called to be responsible to the Lord. Stand up for him individually. And then lastly, we can celebrate great victories. We can celebrate great victories. God encourages the regular celebration of victories achieved through responsibility. We have a great victory that we are celebrating this month, and that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because at the cross, he defeated sin and death for everyone who places their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And if you're here and you have not placed your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ, then I'm concerned about your ability to celebrate that victory of Jesus raising from the dead with us. Because it means nothing for those who have not placed their faith and trust and reliance upon Jesus Christ. And so if you haven't understood that Jesus died for your sins and rose from the dead, then I would hope that you would trust that today and talk to someone who's able to lead you in an understanding of that and to get to know what God's grace can do for you. In chapter 9, verse 27 and 28, the Jews were encouraged to hold a feast. It says, the Jews established and imposed upon themselves and their descendants and all who had joined them that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. The good days should be remembered by the Jews, was the point. The days when their certain destruction was avoided. In chapter 9, it's made very clear that they should not forget. Don't fail to forget. And it would be viewed as a failure to forget what God had done to deliver them from extermination. The Jews marked this day down as an extremely important day to breathe a sigh of relief at the provision of God. What is it about the providence of God that you have been able to celebrate. That you say, without fail, I'm going to remember what God has done for me. This week we get to celebrate an adoption. May we never forget the ways that God delivers us from all our fears in every situation. And the things that he does in our life is not the result of a coincidence. God has given us a responsibility to take our lives and to use them for his glory. And when we see his hand, we get to celebrate out loud. From this point forward, we learn one last cool mention in this last chapter. In chapter 10, we see Mordecai the Jew. He was second in command, and he was great among his people. And I love the second statement, and he was well received by everyone, and was known for looking out for the good of every single individual every day. That's cool to know about Mordecai as we wrap it up. When we trust God with our life, we realize that our lives should not be viewed as coincidental blessings. That, man, I'm glad it worked out, but instead intentional responsibilities given to us by God to set us apart for a specific responsibility he has for us that will lead us to victory in the present and certainly for eternity. So, as we wrap it up, what can we learn? What can we learn? Trust God in the areas of responsibility we are placed in now. And take the opportunity to build relationships and our character every single day. Secondly, obey the Lord in all things, and when you encounter opposition, know that he will deal with that in his timing. He will be there for you. And then stand up no matter what position you find yourself in and celebrate the victories. Life on earth does not have to go peachy for us to know that God takes care of us. But we know he takes care of us because he's got an eternity plan for us, whether we serve him in life or in death. We can have hope in him in all things. As we conclude, I think it's important to realize that this whole story is pretty amazing. A young orphan girl, raised by her cousin, removed from her homeland, parentless, was placed in the position to deliver an entire nation from extermination. God can and will use you and I for many responsibilities. Some responsibilities that we are given will provide us with the joy of seeing victory achieved. Other times, the responsibilities we are given may end up in seeming failure or a literal standstill in our life. It is our job to remember that God is always faithful. God is always faithful in every situation. Whether it is the joy of seeing victory achieved or the seeming failure or literal standstill, remember God is always faithful in every situation. Let's pray. Lord, you are good. And it is intense to see the way your hand works out in our lives. I pray as we consider the book of Esther and as we wrapped it up today, that we would realize that there are certain responsibilities within our life that we got to step up to the risk. Because, Lord, there are bigger things to lose if we don't risk it. And Lord, there are times when you're asking us to just be faithful. And that may seem like it's too small of a thing. But Lord, help us to be that nonetheless. And there's times when life is not even close to the way we envisioned it. And that can be good, and that can be worse than we were thinking. But Lord, help us to know that you're with us every single step of the way. And Lord, none of that hope that we get is through us just being special people. But Lord, it's because we understand that without Jesus Christ, we have no contentment and we have no peace. It is you that gives us peace eternally, and we thank you for it. We praise this all in Jesus' name. Amen. as you go through this week, be sure to point that out to the people around.